So I mentioned a technique called MIDI mapping in a previous section, and I wanted to show an example of that. I'm using a different record from the same artist. In the record I've been using, How to Survive an Apocalypse, the bass line's been too musical for this particular technique, but when the bass gets really rhythmic, sometimes this technique can be really good. It's a very nuanced technique. It applies to more than just the bass. I'm going to break down the thought process and how it works, but I'm going to show you first why I would choose to do it. So here's the section of the chorus. So we have that marching bass, bump, 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 bump. It's holding the groove down. So I want the physical impact of the low end to really cut through. Now watch what happens when I try and boost up the sub-region. The sub gets there, but it doesn't really have the right impact. It doesn't have that visceral pushing sort of flavor, and it also sounds just a little flubby and weird, and no matter where I put my EQ curve in the sub range, it never really totally got there, and the reason is because the bass doesn't have a fundamental sub, ultimately. And so I need to figure out a way to get that low end in there if I want to use it. And there's definitely a lot of techniques for doing this. One technique would be to use something like low ender. In this particular case, I found that it created too large of a bass and the kick just simply vanished. And it was also a little bit muddy. It was taking too much tweaking to really get right. So here's what I did. I have some automation going on. I have a low pass coming in. So I'm cutting out a lot of that sub, the stuff that's going on at like 50 hertz and below, and I'm really focusing on that primary bass range, which is up in the 100, 150 category. That's where this bass is really living. Now what I've also done is I've taken the original bass and I've Melodyne it. Right, this is my original bass, and I've ran it through Melodyne. So it's detecting the pitch. And one thing that I did was first of all, I pitch corrected the bass because just for certain types of styles, like especially if you're doing pop music, this one, if I wasn't doing a technique where I was going to be dubbing a synth underneath the bass, I wouldn't have done this because the style doesn't call for a perfectly tuned bass. But if you're doing something that's like really poppy and has a bass guitar instead of a synth bass, tuning the bass to be like right on pitch can actually be really helpful. But that's an aside. So if you go down to settings here, it says save as MIDI. And what that does is it takes all of the notes and timing that's been generated by Melodyne, and it saves it as a MIDI file. So then I import the MIDI file, and I pull up a synth, right? And this time I'm using the FabFilter 2, and I'm using this to create a sub-synth. Usually I just go through some presets, and if I find something that I like, then I keep that and maybe tweak it a little bit. So I then rendered my soft synth, and it sounds like this. Right, really like heavy, thick sub type sound. Throwing a little bit of distortion on there, and I end up with this. So now I have this separate bass. It's a synth bass. It's no way related in terms of sound except for the note and timing to the original bass. So here's my original bass. Then I bring in the new sub-synth. And in the record, it sounds like this. So it's a cool technique. The basic idea is you get whatever you want to reinforce, you run it through Melodyne, you get the MIDI map in Melodyne, you hit save as MIDI, You then import the MIDI file that you've generated and you throw it through a soft synth of your choosing. And this can be really good for keyboards, pianos, with vocals. You can do it using like choir synths and things like that. It's a really useful technique if the arrangement feels like it's a little sparse for the production, or if you need to fill out the sound in a particularly unique way. So this next technique is going to be a drum room technique. Sometimes you get a recording where the drum room either just doesn't sound that good, or you just don't get a room capture at all, which is the case in this record. And so in my experience, when you have a very dry drum set, it kind of works because you get a little bit of the tone of the room in the overheads, but it sounds a little bit like it's samples almost. It just doesn't sound really dimensional. So I'm going to pull in a drum room real quick. And while this is a little bit hack and slash, right away it sounds a lot more dimensional. And here's what I'm doing. Basically, in rock, it's a pretty old technique at this point to really crush the snot out of a room capture. It sort of gives the impression of the room, which is normally tighter, being bigger than it really is. So what I like to do is I like to start with my snare and my overheads, and I will send the snare and overheads to a room return, which is right here. And on that return, I'll use a reverb. I actually usually prefer my Bricasti because it's really realistic, and I can get like a super, it sounds like it came with a room capture, which is pretty awesome. For the purposes of this demonstration, I'm using the Manny Reverb, which is certainly not bad. It's a little bit more appropriate for things that sound a touch more open and maybe not as natural, but maybe glossier. So anyway. So I start with that room sound. It's a slightly long room sound, so I'm going to turn the timing down just a little bit. All right, sounds like a fairly large studio, basically. My next step is going to be to take this distressor emulation, and I'm going to use it to make the room sound really crunchy and really compressed. Right, so it brings out a certain aggressiveness because there's a little bit of distortion in the room sound itself. There's a longer decay. Not that the timing is really longer, but the arc of it feels longer, so it kind of makes the space feel bigger. And then the very last step is to take an EQ. And this is something I like to do. I don't mind rooms that sound like rooms, but I've become particularly fond of rooms that are treated almost as if they are actual kits. So there's my room sound. It's been EQ'd so that it kind of sounds like the whole kit is in there. And, you know, if I can squeeze a little extra treble out of there. Cool. So now I'll bring my drums back in. And what I'll do is I'll bypass my effects and go through them one at a time. So here's just with a room. Compressed. All right, you hear that release a little more? EQ'd. And in the mix. Without it. With. Much more three-dimensional, a lot more energy really put together. And of course, this is in one of the dense sections. So, you know, once we go to sparser sections, these things are much more pronounced. So before finishing out the tutorial, I just want to go over a quick little overview of how I bring in all of these peripheral elements. A lot of arrangements, it's pretty standard to have things that are not central to the musical action, but are meant to augment the feel of the record. So in this record, we've got stomps, we've got claps, we've got a Juno, we've got organ. So there's a whole bunch of that kind of stuff. And I want to go over my basic ideas for the treatments. So a lot of it is pretty simple, you know, mostly level. The organ in particular really didn't need much going on. I have like the ever so slightest bit of top end boost just to kind of bring out some overtones and a high pass filter. And the high filter boost is barely noticeable. It's like really a subtle thing that's just ever so slightly bringing it forward and giving it a little bit more of a three-dimensional image. That's all that top end is doing. It's really pretty much not doing anything of note, and even if it wasn't there, it wouldn't totally ruin the record. The stomps, it's a little bit more decisive what I'm doing. I'm taking out the sub in the stomp to allow the sub of the kick, which is a lot tighter and more focused, to take over the sub range. That might actually be better. Sounds a little weak. I don't mind a little bit of muddiness and a little bit of confusion going on in this region if it gives the right energy. These other stomps, they're just tucked in really low. They're just meant to augment the main stomp. Right, nothing magical there. The claps, I'm doing a little bit of something unique in that I'm using Decapitator to kind of clip it. So you hear that without Decapitator, it sounds, you know, basically like a clap. With Decapitator on, you'll hear that it sort of squares off a little bit. And normally you want to avoid squaring things off, but with claps it can actually be a really cool effect. Then I've got my reverb tucked into it. This clap is a little bit more unique because I decided rather than having it live right in the middle, I would use a delay technique called the Haas effect to give it some space. So what gives it that stereo effect is that the left side has no delay on it, but the right side is being delayed by 10 milliseconds. And so since the left side and right side are no longer coming in at the same time, it's as if I have two separate clap sounds, one on the left, one on the right. And that creates a really cool stereo image. And when it's paired up with other things, we just get a wider image overall. So here's without it. Kind of mono-ish. Much wider. So then we have this Juno sound. And I'm doing nothing to it. Literally nothing. No high pass, no low pass, no EQ, no nothing, because it sounds perfect. It sounds the way it's supposed to sound. It sounds like the way that it came in, it was tracked a little hot or something like that. There's a little bit of tonal saturation through whatever kind of amps it's going through. And that to me has enough personality. It just fit right in the mix. So I always start with level. And if the level works and it just works in the arrangement, there's really no need to do anything. I know this is all about advanced techniques, but I think the most advanced technique is knowing when not to do something. Because if something comes in and it's spot on, or it's like really close to spot on and maybe only just needs like, you know, a basic high-pass filter or something like that, there's no reason to start doing all of these crazy techniques that I've talked about. These crazy techniques that are in this video are meant to augment the mixing process, not to make the mixing process, if that makes sense. And I think that's a really good note to end on, because ultimately, at the end of the day, the difference between good and great isn't solely resting on the techniques. It's having all the techniques in your arsenal, you know, doing all of your research, going through videos like this and picking up different techniques and approaches and things like that, but also knowing how to pick the right technique based on the style, and also knowing that you don't always need to be going to very advanced, complicated techniques. You don't always need to be augmenting drums with triggered drums, or, you know, using crazy plugins like Pi or the other one that I can't even pronounce because it's like some German company and all this kind of crazy stuff, or like manipulating mid-side images and things like that. Ultimately, we just want to hear our end result. We want to keep focused on that musical beacon, and that's the most advanced, most refined skill out of all of the skills when it comes to mixing. All right, guys, till next time.